All right, tonight, sit tight for part 5, Debunking Missionary Claims. I'm going to be discussing contradictions in the New Testament based on Michael Brown's claims. So sit tight, we'll be right back. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Debunking Missionary Claims, or Derailing the Missionary Train of Thought, with Rabbi Moshe Shulman. Welcome back, Rabbi. It's a pleasure to always have you here, for sure. Can't wait to get into our topic tonight, for sure.
Yep.
It's a pleasure.
Okay, fine. We're actually the 5th show dealing with Dr. Brown's famous lecture from 1991, which is called Unequal Weights and Measures. I just want to do a very quick review.
From last week, right?
I think, what?
Are you doing a quick review from last week or from the past?
Yeah, just basically, just a basic idea for anybody who's listening for the first time.
Okay, great, great, very good.
Yeah, I hope that actually next week will be the last one that we will do. After that, we're going to discuss go into the New Testament as to why you should not bet your salvation, your soul, or anything on that being Scripture.
Very good, very good.
We'll get into that. That will be a lot of fun.
Yes, indeed, for sure.
However, what I want to do is continue with this. We've been dealing with that lecture of Dr. Brown on equal weights and measures. The bottom line for that lecture is, for those of you who haven't seen it, but you should really search on the internet to see it. The bottom line for that is to try and say that those people who are doing what I'm going to be doing in this series are basically being hypocritical. They are using unequal standards. They're asking questions that they would not accept being asked to them, or other ways to do what's called the fallacy of poisoning the well. Basically trying to get you not to listen to it, not to listen to what I'm going to be showing you is actually what the truth is. So that's what they're trying to do. And Brown tries to convince you not to do it because, as missionaries will do, as I've seen many times, they will try and convince people not to talk to people like me, or Jews who are intimately knowledgeable about Christianity and what's wrong with it, because they don't want you to actually come to the truth. Well, in their case, they don't think it's coming to the truth. They don't want you, get Satan to take you away and you go to hell forever. I mean, they mean it for your best, but it's not really for your best.
Right.
Okay, so that's basically what the paper's about. I just want to, before I continue, again clarify why am I going over it, because it's really not something that a lot of people might see as important. The reason why I'm doing it as important is because Dr. Brown and many counter missionaries, especially the Jewish ones, will use either that directly or the ideas indirectly to try and convince people not to listen to any of the arguments by counter missionaries like myself. People who bring arguments from actually apologists for Judaism, trying to show the truth of Judaism, should listen to people like us, because somehow we are disreputable, we are not honest about what we are doing, we ask questions and assumptions and deal with things that we would not accept ourselves. So the main point that I've been doing in this, as I said before, is to basically give you the idea that, in fact, there's nothing unequal about these objections. Many, in fact, all of the things that Brown mentions that could be asked of the rabbis, referring to the anti-missionary rabbis, he calls us, those questions are actually asked for us, and in fact, we do need to answer it. My point, of course, with Dr. Brown, many times, as I've said it clearly, is that there are two aspects. Number one, these are valid questions which we can answer, we try to answer. Although I'm not saying that everything has an answer we can understand, but we do try to answer. And number two is, many times our answers are drawn from things that Dr. Brown would not find acceptable, or from different things. For example, we don't believe in the same types of concepts of inerrancy, which we'll get into a few instances now to show why we don't believe the same types of inerrancy. And certain problems that Dr. Brown would consider problems, we don't even consider problems or of any importance. So that's basically what the purpose is of covering this first. rather than getting into more of the juicier stuff, which I know there's a lot of people just waiting for me to get into more juicier stuff. But this is my purpose really is to go into things with depth that you usually do not get dealing with these types of subjects. You usually get things, correct information, good information, but not with the kind of depth that I really like to, I would really like to get along to people. Something that you could tell your friends, hey, listen to this, and, it's not superficial. It might take you, a few hours to listen to the whole thing, but then you really will understand what the real issues are involved, not all the superficial stuff you get. So again, Dr. Brown, essentially in his paper, divides things into 3 types of objections that he considers to be invalid. The first one was hyperliterality, where Catholic missions take things in the New Testament, for example, and take it in a literal way. The one we discussed, which seems most people reading like most, is the complaint that your God wore diapers. And I pointed out actually that that's a very serious question, since Tertullian and others actually understand the incarnation to imply that. And he brought a few things that Judaism has to answer. And these really are such things like how God could not know with Abraham. We discussed that's really that knowledge does not imply forcing him to act, and why they killed the Canaanites and slaves and things of that nature. So we discussed many of these types of issues before. The next part was alleged contradictions, and we are holding actually in the middle of that. And the third part is alleged misquotes. So the alleged contradictions, we pointed out in the New Testament a well-known contradiction in Acts 7:16, where Stephen says, talks about that Abraham bought the graves in Shem, where in fact it's known that Abraham bought his grave sites in Hebron, Kiryas Arba, which of course is, until today, is called still Hebron, and that is a place where Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov are all buried. And we discussed, we showed actually that a lot of Christian commentaries actually trying to figure out ways that, but as Beale and Parsons say, basically there's no good ways out of it. Okay, so these are valid questions. If you want to review some of the earlier discussions that I have had, I don't want to go over them again. So I'd really like to continue. And today what I'd like to do is I'd like to finish with the alleged contradictions and the misquotes, alleged misquotes. If there is some time, I'll field some questions that may be either in the chat or maybe, I don't know, if you all want to open up to people to call, they can call also, that's fine. But not really sure if we will have time. Next week, I will deal with Dr. Brown's conclusions that he brings from his paper, and we will go through each one of the conclusions and discuss what's valid or invalid about that. And then I will actually do from my side, what are my conclusions about this whole issue? What's a valid way for a person like myself to critique, analyze, or go into the New Testament and Christianity and discuss it in a way that is, fair, which is basically what the verses are talking about. You have true or fair weights and measures when you're doing things. And in the same sense, as a person dealing with someone's religion, we have to have a certain sensitivity. Every people believe things very sincerely, so we have to deal with truth and fairness. We're not trying to trick anybody into believing something, or trick anybody into, recognizing that what they're believing is not true. We want to really deal in truth and fairness, and that's different from the concept of unequal weights and measures. So again, the things that we're going to discuss here, the questions that Dr. Brown does ask about Judaism in his paper, if you could read this, I did not go on every single one of them. If you read his paper, he asks some very, very legitimate questions, and actually all of those are really discussed in the Jewish commentaries. Nobody's hiding these questions. And you as a Christian should not consider, any questions I might ask, you should look and see, are those Christian commentaries hiding those questions from you, or the answers from that, or discussions of that. Okay? So let's continue. Last week, I believe we mentioned Dr. Brown talks about the differences between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Genesis 1 follows the creation by day by day. This happened this day, this happened that day. Where Genesis 2 talks about it differently, in a different type of format, just talking about the general concept of creation and what happened in the creation of Adam and Eve. And these are, in fact, different. What I did point out is that's a very valid question. Those people who know the scholarly works will know that the scholars incorrectly try and say that indicates that there's two different types of authors. And the point that I tried to make last week is, in fact, that's not really the truth. That does not really follow. We know, in fact, that there are stories repeated twice, incidents repeated multiple times, and they in no way indicate that there are multiple authorship involved. I may sometime down the line actually go into the idea of Bible criticism, because there is a difference in Bible criticism in the Tanakh and the New Testament. But we might leave that off for later. Okay, so that was one. Dr. Brown also brings a number of differences that are very well known. In the Tanakh, there are two relations of the history of the Jewish people. In the book of Shmuel and Melech, and that's Samuel and Kings, which actually follows the books of Yeshua and Shoftim, which is Joshua and Judges. Those are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, is the history of the Jewish people from when they entered the land of Canaan, which became the land of Israel, or actually the two nations, Israel and Judah, from the time of the entry until the actual exile and destruction of the first temple. And now the book of Chronicles, in many ways, mirrors that, except Chronicles' emphasis is only on Judah. It does not really talk very much about what happens in the northern kingdom after the split. Its primary discussion is revolving around the kingdom of Judah, the house of David, things like that. So it is very well known that you do find on occasions that there are differences between the two places. In the story, slightly different. Sometimes something adds, sometimes something is different. Again, these are valid questions. I don't have one here offhand that was mentioned by Dr. Brown, but it's just so well known that it's not even a question as to whether they exist, and they certainly do exist. These are in fact discussed in the Jewish commentaries about them, reconciling religious relations. These are differences. Now, one of the problems, this is actually exemplifies one of the main. I do believe that all these are reconcilable, even were they not. Let us say that there is a certain thing that it says in the Book of Kings, which difference is different from the Book of Chronicles. This would no way bother me at all, because we don't believe in the concept of the inerrancy of these books. These books are historical. Their purpose is to tell the story of the Jewish people, and if there is something that disagrees, it's a minor issue. It has nothing to do really with the basis of our faith, of Judaism. It's just telling us different things about what God did for us in the Jewish people's history. If you get something wrong, a good example that I think of all the time is if you go back a few generations, I know stories, for example, my great-grandfather, my grandfather, that I was told, if it ended up that my great aunt, who I got most of the information from, what she told me was not exactly correct, or for example, my father fought in World War II, and I heard from my mother something, but if it happens that when I spoke to somebody else, it wasn't exactly correct, that does not stop the fact that my father was actually a soldier in World War II, but my great-grandfather was actually who was, and the things like that, and pictures I have really look like that. This doesn't change fundamentally what the story is. It doesn't mean that just because it's not true. It doesn't mean that I didn't have a great-grandfather. It doesn't mean that my father didn't actually live during the time the war and actually was in the U.S. Army. These things happen. It just means that that particular story may have been either exaggerated or incorrect. And the same thing would be, of course, about the Book of Kings or Chronicles or whatever. If the story is not if something's missing, although I do not believe that to be the case. But even were that the case, I don't have a problem because we don't have that concept of inerrancy that you find in Christianity. This is something that I asked back to Dr. Brown, or any Christian who has things. If you see actually something between Chronicles and King that is actually different and disagrees, what is your answer to that? How would you deal with it? If it's irreconcilable, which I don't really think there is one, but I might find something that's really the reconciliation that is pretty far-fetched. I'm not sure whether I'm accepting it because I think it's rational, or because it's just my basic faith. But let's say something that is, I consider somewhat a little far-fetched. I accept it because I accept the truth of what I've been, my rabbis. What do you as a Christian when you say something like that? So we look at these things differently. These are not, there's fundamental differences involved here. And, we have to understand that. And part of what I'm trying to point out here is, in fact, that there are some very fundamental differences. We have certain rabbinic traditions, which last week when we read Josephus says specifically that as early as the 2nd century BCE, 2nd, 3rd century BCE, the Pharisees were known to have had traditions going back generations and generations. Who knows how far they went back? We can, as far as in historical knowledge, where we can prove it, we can prove going back to the 2nd century BCE. We believe that it goes back even farther. That's a question of belief as far as proof. Proving, we can prove that it goes to at least the 2nd century BCE, which is when Pharisaic Judaism has literal mean in the sense of being literary, written documentation as to it. Some things we don't have documentation to. So I can only argue with you, say this is the fact and the rest is something that I believe based on the source that Josephus says it goes back even further, and he was closer to death than I was. It's interesting to note that what Josephus says about the Pharisees is not any different than what I say now, 2,000 years later, about the rabbis, the traditions we have going back generations. Lots of people don't know about these traditions, and sometimes they'll come up and I'll actually show how we have our traditions, where they come from. But that's basically it. These kinds of textual and contradictions that you sometimes find are basically not really so much of an issue. They are, in fact, valid questions. And so, in fact, the questions we ask for the New Testament are also valid. If there is a contradiction, it's valid. Now, we'll be dealing, obviously, later on in many, many of these types of differences. But what I would like to do is just deal with one instance. We're not going to go into it in depth because we're going to go into in depth of this later on. But one of the points that I'm trying to make that we see here, that there are contradictions in the New Testament, which are in fact quite difficult to understand and reconcile. We're not going to discuss either the attempts of reconciliation yet right now, but we are going to, just want to give you an idea. The best one what I want to do now is look at something that just by reading it, you'll see obviously that there are some very serious differences in these two stories. And this deals with the resurrection. We're going to have a whole show. I don't know if I'll be able to do it in one time or two times, dealing with the resurrection and why you should not believe it and why there's no basis of it to believe that it actually occurred. That's when we would discuss the issues. As part of the issue of discussing the historical Jesus, we will actually discuss the historicity issue of the resurrection. But fundamental to understanding it is that in the gospel accounts, Paul says that Jesus was resurrected. We will get to that, whether he understands his physical resurrection, whether he understands his seeing Jesus is actually a physical seeing or a image type seeing, like seeing in a dream or something like that. But that's an issue for later. But let's just look at the basic differences and just think about it. We don't need to discuss it out right now in depth, but I'm just trying to bring the point out that there are, in fact, some very serious differences and contradictions in the New Testament, which counter-missions will bring up, and which need to be addressed seriously. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what appears in the resurrection account. And what I will do is, I want to read from Mark. I was going to read from Matthew, but I just want to read from Mark and then from John. Mark is the earliest gospel, according to the overwhelming number of scholars that look at it. And when I'm talking scholars, I'm talking about Christian scholars also, believe that Mark was the earliest written.
Right.
One. When we go into our next, in the next series of lectures, when I do discuss the New Testament, the canon of it, I will actually give you reasons as to why Mark is known to have been the first one, at least predating Matthew and Luke. Okay, but let's look what it says. We'll just read we're going to read the shorter version of the Mark. There's a longer version of Mark's ending, and we will discuss that also later on, the difference between the shorter and the longer, and why there is a difference here, and some Christian scholars say about it. So this is chapter 16 of the book of Mark. So here it is.
Hey, Rabbi, real quick, just for notation purposes, right?
Yes.
Chapter 16, the last 10 or 15 verses were added, right? They weren't in the original.
Yes, I really want to discuss this when we discuss the canon.
Okay,
and
great.
The actual text of the New Testament.
Okay, great, very good.
Because in that context, I will actually discuss what evangelical scholars high-rated scholars, people that I actually respect, though I disagree with them.
Got it. Okay, go ahead. 16.
Other things, but people who are worthy of respect for their scholarship and their their religiosity and their belief.
Very good. So what verse do you want to start with? Chapter 16?
We'll do 16, and we'll do basically the short.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay? I don't want to read the long because, there's
You probably don't have time.
Well, it's not that I can make the time for it, but really,
right.
Picking up snakes and stuff like that,
All right, let's do it.
Bart Ehrman has a funny joke about that. We'll leave that joke for later on. Okay. So it says here, 16, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they may go and anoint him, meaning Jesus' body who was in the grave. Why it's that we'll get in when we deal with the resurrection, we'll bring all these things together.
Okay.
And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. That means Sunday morning. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. You should know, I'm reading from the Reserve Standard Version, which is from the New Testament version that I have here called the Jewish Annotated New Testament, because it has notes here from Jewish New Testament scholars.
All right.
They're not rabbinic scholars, so I don't consider them rabbis like that, but they're Jewish scholars, so they do have some perspective of things, of what's going on. So just you should know what it is, in case you are KJV people who are wondering what I'm saying because it doesn't agree. When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is a place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Okay, that's where it ends. There are some alternate endings to it, but I'm not going to do the alternate endings because it's pretty much agreed that they edit. Just for notifications purpose, we're not going to get into this later on, but if you read this and you understand it this way, they were told to do something and they didn't listen, obviously, or they did, and then we don't know where the story came from, but that's a different story. Okay, so let's go to John. John has this a little bit differently. Okay?
All right.
I just want you to listen to simple. We'll get into more details when we actually deal with the resurrection, but I just want you to get an idea that there exists some real contradictions here. How we'll deal with it and discuss that, we can discuss with the resurrection, but it has to come into, I want it to come into your mind that you understand that there are real contradictions here.
Right.
So chapter 20 of John. Early on the first day of the week, while it is still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. Okay, so in both cases, of course, we see the stone was returned, but here we have only Mary and not three women going together.
Right.
This is very important. Let's follow what happens here. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. So here she runs and comes to two men. Mark has nothing about that. Okay? And no, they haven't seen an angel or anything like that yet, or anything like that. Right. And said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. So after Mary and John has gone to the tomb and left it, she has no idea what's flying. Whereas Mary in Mark actually meets an angel there who tells her immediately what happened. Okay, now we continue, verse 3. Then Peter and the other disciples set out and went toward the tomb. So now Mary sort of disappears, or she's there. I think she comes with them, but whatever. So Peter and the other disciple, who the one who Jesus loved, is usually considered to have been John. Can't guarantee it, but that's usually what I understand from Christians.
That's what I heard too. Right.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't learn in yeshiva. I had to learn from yeshiva.
They don't teach that in the yeshiva.
No, we didn't have a class in that kind of stuff.
That's awesome. Okay.
We just learned simple things like, what foods to eat, what blessings to say, things just to live your normal life, not,
right.
Not to do this. This is not, that's not what was important for our lives. Okay, two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. So here you see they're actually having a foot race. Very nice Greek thing to do. The Olympics, they used to have races. So I guess Peter and the other were running out. And it seems that John was a little bit more robust and in better shape than Peter was, because he comes there first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. So they're staying outside. Then Simon Peter came and followed him and went to him. So John, let's say it was John, the beloved disciple, went with Peter together. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrapping, but rolled up in a place by itself. So he sees a little bit different. No angel there. No angel sitting inside there like in Mark. Then the other disciple reached the tomb first, also went in and saw, and he believed. What did he believe? I don't know. It doesn't say here what he believed. He believed Jesus wasn't there. For as yet they did not, they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. So they didn't even know he was supposed to rise from the dead. This is very important because you actually see this as a fact. It comes up very quickly. Then the disciples returned to their homes. Okay, so they just ran. They went, didn't know it was there, it wasn't there, nothing happened. They go home. He's gone. I have no idea what's going on. It's gone. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. So Mary sees the angels, but the other two didn't. So the angels just appeared out of nowhere. Not a big deal, by the way. Angels can appear out of nowhere. They're not really physical beings, but they can come into physical form. So they don't necessarily have to follow our laws like walking in. They could have just appeared there. So there's nothing really interesting about that. Just the case is that they weren't there when the other two went in, but they are there now that Mary's there.
Let me ask you a question, because all this stuff, it would be very easy for anybody, especially a Messianic, I'll call him a scholar. I mean, I'll give him a little bit of credit there. Dr. Michael Brown, he does study, and he's a lot more educated than most people I've heard. But what do you say when it comes down to something like this, and you have to define for that person the difference between a vantage point, which is that's kind of the tool they use. They say it's a vantage point versus a blatant contradiction. I mean, there has to be some rule that declares which is which, and why is it that they can get away with calling it a vantage point when it actually is not a vantage point situation? I
understand what you're saying. I'd like to leave this in depth until later on. It's going to actually come up two places. One is called when we discuss in the next lecture series, when we talk about the canon. We're going to talk about a work called the Diatessaron.
Okay.
Titian, who was a student of Papias, if I remember correctly. I'll look at my notes before we do that. What he made is he produced the first harmony gospel, which you can still get now.
Okay.
It was written in Syriac and was actually used in Syria, in that area, the people, Aramaic-speaking people, used that until about the 5th century when the Peshitta took over. And that's very interesting. And basically, when I get to that, we'll talk about that. And the second thing, we'll talk about it when I actually talk about the resurrection. We'll try and bring up some of the answers. The basic answers that they try and say is, well, you can reconcile most of these things. There's 4 points of view, but it's very difficult to do that. And we'll go into more depth when we discuss the resurrection. I'm just trying to point out that we have a legitimate question here. Okay?
Okay, sure.
My point with talking about weights and measures is that these are legitimate questions. The question is not whether you can answer or what kind of answer, or whether the answer really makes sense to you. If you're looking at it objectively, does that answer make sense? And by the way, I'm not saying that every answer that Christians give to some of these things don't make sense. Some of them, could possibly be true.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Very good.
But there's enough that are not possibly true to make it a very serious question.
Okay.
But again, they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" Okay. So again, we see here something very serious. In John, Mary is weeping. She's depressed. She's sad. She's crying. She has no idea what's going on. Whereas we don't see any of that nature there, because of course the angels told her to begin with, and from the very beginning, that she shouldn't worry about anything. She has no time to get to a state of being frantic. Whereas John, you see, she gets the time because she's being frantic. So they said to her, the angel said to her, "Why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." So they obviously don't know anything about the resurrection.
Right.
So all of this that we see in other places where the claims that Jesus taught about, that he was going to be dying and resurrected while he was alive, apparently nobody knew about that.
Right. Just like Paul never heard of the virgin birth scenario.
Yeah. But that's another issue, what Paul did or did not know. Paul is interesting. We have to deal with him later on. I don't want to get too focused. I like to focus on what I'm dealing with now.
Okay.
If we get into too many things, we'll just talk on and I'll never finish any of this stuff.
It's more like
so much to talk about.
So you're handling it like a sniper, not like a shotgun. Okay, got it.
Yeah, no, I want to do these things in a depth that you usually don't get.
That's true. Very good.
You usually do not get to actually look at these things and analyze them carefully, and then discuss them in a serious manner.
Very true.
So they said to her, "They've taken away the wood." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know it was Jesus. Now that is, to me, it's always been one of the most phenomenal things. Here she was, somebody who's very close to Jesus during lifetime. She saw him all the time. And it's only a day or so since, the crucifixion. And she doesn't recognize him?
Right.
Okay. That means that Jesus seemed to not, his resurrected form seemed to not be like a physical type of resurrection from when he died. It seemed to be something different.
Okay.
There are discussions that we'll discuss this later with the resurrections and stuff like that. There are discussions as to what kind of a body Jesus was raised in. So that has a lot to do with Paul, for example, what he's seeing when he says resurrection. Does it mean a physical resurrection or some kind of a form? Now we'll see this from John. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Now this is great. Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, she thinks he's the gardener, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me, where have you laid him, and I will take him away." That doesn't sound like she ever heard about the resurrection supposed to happen. Her first thought is that there's an empty tomb, somebody stole the body.
Right.
Keep this in mind, because when we talk about the resurrection, one of the things that polemicists for Christianity, William Lane Craig, Michael Lacona, a few other those who discuss about that, one of the minimal facts that they have is that the tomb was empty. And the argument about that is, even if the tomb was empty, it doesn't prove there was a resurrection at all. It's not a piece of evidence.
Absolutely.
Because even Mary did not believe it.
Right.
But we'll leave that issue to later, because that's a very, very deep subject. We have to go into that in depth.
Okay.
I don't want to, cover it in a way. Just keep it in the back of your mind, so when it comes up, hey, the rabbi's going to give a shear on that later on. So,
okay. Very good.
Okay, so if you got to go, Jesus said to her, "Mary." So I guess she recognized his voice when he talked. She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," to my teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father." So apparently she shouldn't touch him. "But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascended to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to announce to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her. So among the differences, of course, is they're never told to go to Galilee and a few other things of that nature. But not wanting to go into it in depth, we will, in fact, go into it much depth later on and discuss whether the answers given by Christians really help these problems. But we see that there are actually very serious differences, much more differences there than we find between the books of Samuel, the book of Kings and Chronicles. The point of all this is very simple. Yes, there are contradictions. We will discuss this more in depth to see what they answer on those. But to say that there's some kind of invalidity involved when a counter missionary brings these up because it just happens that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 has differences, or Kings and Chronicles has differences, that's just totally false. The truth is the truth. If they could both, in fact, be wrong. Another problem with that is maybe this is wrong, or maybe Chronicles and Kings is wrong. There's no either or here. Maybe they're both wrong. Maybe we're all wrong about this.
Right.
A Jew has to also prove his faith, why he believes in what he believes. That's fundamental also. I mean, Christianity does not exist without Judaism being true at one time. But let's go on. So anyways, so we see a lot of differences here that go on like that. And this is just, one of the many differences that we find, differences between Paul and in Acts and in the Galatians and other places. Throughout the New Testament, there's the constant differences between what occurs in John and the Synoptics. It's just a phenomenal amount, and we'll go into a lot of them there. The point of being is that these are, in fact, valid questions. The fact that I happen to be Jewish and an apologist for Judaism and somebody who's trying to convince Jews who've gotten involved in Christianity that that's the wrong way does not invalidate the questions that I'm asking. And the fact that there may be similar questions in the Tanakh does not invalidate that either.
Right.
Okay, let's go on a little bit more. I see I've taken a little bit more time on this than I thought. Okay, next thing he brings, alleged misquotes. Now, there are a few of these that he brings. Let me bring the first one. It was going to be actually the third one I was going to bring. But let me bring that first because I consider it the most important of all of them. It's from the Talmud. And it's a very good question, by the way. And in fact, I'm going to show you that our commentaries actually deal with the question head on, in a way that I don't think a Christian would answer in the New Testament. So this is what Dr. Brown says. Okay. In addition to apparent misinterpretations, the actual Talmudic citations of the Hebrew scriptures sometimes vary from the Masoretic text tradition. And there is at least one instance in which part of a verse not found in any Masoretic biblical manuscript is quoted by the 4th century sage Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, to the consternation of later Talmudic commentaries. Consternation is a bit of an exaggeration, but let's deal with the situation, what it is. This is a passage in the Talmud, in this Tractate Bruchos, 61a. Now, the discussion here, let me give a little bit of background. The discussion here is talking about proper actions for people. And it says here, discusses just a little bit early to this, that it is improper for a man to walk behind a woman. In fact, it's better to walk behind a lion than a woman. The reason is obvious, because if you walk behind a woman, you might come to have certain types of thoughts which could lead you to certain types of actions. So if it's avoidable, you should try and do that. Unfortunately, today people don't really follow that. I think a lot of politicians who would, if they would follow the Jewish laws of how they're supposed to deal with men and women relations, not things like that, I think we would be in a lot less trouble than is going on. Actually, I have to say, just a political thing, one thing. The Vice President Pence, I have a lot of respect for him that he does not go anywhere together with a woman alone. no matter what. And that, in fact, is actually the way Orthodox Jews like myself live, that we will not be alone with any woman except for our wives or children, relatives, like that, without somebody else being there. It's not a requirement from non-Jews, but it's something Jews do. It's a very good idea, and I have a lot of respect for somebody who does that, even though it's not required, because, of course, obviously, he's not going to have any problems with harassment. But anyways, back to the Talmud here. The Talmud is teaching us that it's proper not to walk after women because you might have certain types of thoughts which are improper. So the Talmud there says, Rav Nachman said that Manoach, I'll just translate as I go on. Manoach was an ignorant person, because the verse says, "V'yalech Manoach achrei ishto," that Manoach went after his wife. The Talmud just told us he shouldn't do it. Obviously, somebody like that, if somebody is a knowledgeable person, he wouldn't do it. So obviously, Manoach is somebody who's not knowledgeable. Okay. Now this is Rav Nachman. Okay. There's a number. Maskef Rav Nachman by Yitzchak. Rav Nachman by Yitzchak is somebody different, and he objected to this, and he asked the question: if that is the case, Alkuna, who was Chana's husband, it says about him, "V'yalech Alkuna achrei ishto." Alkuna went after his wife. The Gabe Elisha says about Elisha, the prophet, the Yukam v'yalech achareho, that he stood up and went after her. So he gives two proofs. One is Alkuna, one from Elisha. Now the problem is, the Gemara discusses it out, it has a little different answer. What about that? Why it's not really such a problem, what's not talking about, whatever. But the point of here is that it's very interesting. That particular verse about Alkuna does not exist. Especially you should know it doesn't exist. And now, by the way, nobody has a problem with that. In any of the Talmudic texts, nobody has a problem that the Talmud doesn't have that, because we don't have a concept in inerrancy. But what we do have is we know about this particular thing. So let's look at it. I have here a special type of Talmud of mine, which has commentaries on it, and it brings commentaries, not just the usual commentaries there, but it brings in others. So let me just bring one commentary here, which is called Tosfos. Tosfos is from the students from Rashi, his students and students, for a number of generations, and they were collected. Basically, there are comments on the Talmud explaining certain things. So this obviously can't go without being something said about it. Rashi, by the way, doesn't say anything about that, because that's not what Rashi is trying to do. But the Tosfos does. And Tosfos says something very simple. So he says on the verse that said, but now, with regards to Alkuna, the verse says, V'yalech Alkuna achrei isha. It says Alkuna went after his wife. So Tosfos says, Shibashi, this is a mix-up. Sha'ayin pusik zi v'chol mikra. This verse doesn't appear anywhere in the Tanakh. And we shouldn't read it. It's a mistake. It shouldn't be there at all. Now, I would love to see Dr. Brown admit that there's mistakes in the New Testament that should be taken out. We're actually going to show you some of those when we talk about the New Testament, where there actually are mistakes in the New Testament. Now, for the Talmud, it's not really a problem, because that's what the Talmud is really not interested in, such things like that. It also has, by the way, a second verse about Elisha. So even if you throw this verse out, if this mistake out, the argument still exists. There are actually two verses brought. One doesn't exist, the second one does. So the whole argument of the Talmud actually doesn't change, and the existence of something that's just a mistake is just a mistake. It doesn't exist. No, it's not really such a serious problem. Now, my particular Talmud here has a number of, it came out recently, a number of years ago, and it brings from many, many sources who discuss the same issue. Now, it mentions Tosfos, and it also mentions the response from the Go'anim. The Go'anim lived, the end of the Go'anim is like the 11th century, early 11th century. So they lived from the 700s, 800s to the thousands. Okay? So they asked Rav Hai Gaon, who lived in, I believe, the 1000s, early 1000s, about many of these verses that appear in the Gemara that.
So Gaon.
What?
So Gaon means genius or whatever, right?
Ga'on is referring to somebody who has a certain high level of knowledge of material. You could not be called that title of Ga'on. Well, Ga'on at that time meant he was the head of the yeshivas. There were two primary yeshivas in the cities of Sira and Pumbedisa.
Okay.
If you were the head of that yeshiva, then you were called the Ga'on. That was the title of the head of that yeshiva.
Okay, good.
And you could not be that unless you knew the whole Talmud completely.
So like Sa'adja Gaon, that would be, Gaon would be his title, but
Sa'adja was
his name.
Before then,
right?
He was the Gaon. I don't remember. I think it was in Surah. I'm not sure. I could look that up if you want for clarification, though.
Yeah, that's okay. I just wanted kind of to give some
but he was the head of yeshiva.
Okay, very good.
Okay, that's why he was called Gaon. Now we call somebody Gaon just to indicate that he's knowledgeable in all of again, you have to don't get I think I mentioned it last week. Don't get hooked up on some of this these titles and things like that, because they're not really relevant. It's really what we're trying to use that title to mean. So when we used Sa'adja Gaon, that meant that he was actually the head of the yeshiva. When we talked to the Vilna Gaon, who lived like 300 years ago, he's called Gaon because his vast breadth of knowledge was such that they called him a Gaon. Nowadays, they'll refer to big Torah scholars as being a Gaon because of their knowledge of Torah learning.
Right,
okay?
Gotcha.
So the title, it's a title that's used. You have to understand what the context is the title is being used for, but don't get hooked up on, just know what the guy's doing.
The only reason I bring up the translation part is because a lot of people who are watching don't have a lot of Hebrew background at all. So clarifying Hebrew terms along the way.
It's good. Yeah.
Okay.
They'll come up. It's like the word rabbi changed over time what it means. Okay?
Right. Gotcha. Very good.
Okay. At one time, rabbi meant specifically somebody who in a city was given the authority to rule on legal issues.
Okay, right.
Then it referred to somebody who also who teaches in the rabbinic institution. Like I taught in yeshiva, so they call me rabbi.
I see. Very good.
It cost me the same amount on the subway, whether I use the title or not. But
okay.
And so it refers to some. Rabbi is a title which has a meaning only within rabbinic Judaism. That's why it's called rabbinic Judaism. So rabbi is a title of a certain status within rabbinic Judaism. Okay, Sephardim used to call them Chacham. Lately, Sephardim use rabbi also. So Avadia Yosef is called Rabbi Avadia Yosef. Really, we use the strict title for Sephardic rabbi would have been Chacham. Okay, but these things don't get hooked up on it.
Okay.
Rabbi doesn't mean a clergyman. That's in the sense of that. That's not what it means.
I was told that rabbi is an acronym for Rosh B'nai Israel.
Okay, that's more homiletic.
Okay. Somebody saw a pattern and said, hey, guess what this could mean, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
It also means Ru b'Einai Hashem. It's the same.
Ah, very good.
Which means evil in the eyes of Hashem. So it depends on the person. Okay?
Got it.
If you're a good person,
very nice.
Following Hashem, then it means Rosh B'nai Yisrael, the head of the Jewish people. And if you're not, then you're bad in the eyes of Hashem.
Ah, I see. Very good. Very good.
Hasidim specifically are not very much into titles. That doesn't mean anything to us.
Right. Gotcha.
Titles are just things of lead to arrogance. So we don't do it. I mean, when a person's older, like in my age group, they call them Reb Moshe. People call me that, but I might get letters sent to me rabbi, but it's
right.
Whatever. Hasidim aren't very much into it. Some people aren't into it. It doesn't mean very much. Okay, so Rabbi Gaon discusses it, and his answer was this: there are places where there are actually mistakes from the scribe. Or there are also things where the students just added into the Talmud, which just didn't belong there. And there are also other places where the Gemara brings, the Talmud brings the language, but not exactly as it appears in the verse itself, for whatever homiletic reason is. So, as far back as them, these are well known. They're known. They're not considered problematic at all, and it's discussed in a lot of places. This guy actually goes where a slight different type of language appears with lacuna. Excuse me. But the bottom line is that in essence, we don't consider it an issue because our view of the Talmud and this particular verse there, it really doesn't affect anything. There is a second verse there which keeps the argument alive, so it doesn't really change that as far as that's concerned. Okay. And we know that in fact there are various reasons why sometimes differences occur. Scribes sometimes made mistakes, and they exist in the Talmud, and these things are known about. Okay, I'll do just one more, then we can actually finish, so that next week I can go into Dr. Brown's conclusions, and then my conclusions, which are somewhat different than his, as you might expect. Now, he brings another one, which is really very interesting, and it points out something that how we actually look at things different. In the Torah, in Deuteronomy 24:16. Let me find it here, 24:16. Oops, my marker fell out.
All right, got you up on screen.
Very good, but I'm going to read it from the Art Scroll, so it's going to be a little bit different, but it doesn't make much of a difference. Okay. Here it is. It says, now I'm going to read the Hebrew only because Dr. Brown makes a big thing about it. And you'll have to excuse you guys because my Hebrew pronunciation is the way we speak in Poland and Galicia and Hungary and some other places, which is probably different than you heard if you know Israeli Hebrew. Lo yimsi uvas abunim ivunim lo yimsi uvas ish b'chetoy yimusi. What that means is very simple. The fathers shall not be put to death because of the sons, and the sons shall not be put to death because of the fathers. Everybody, according to his sin, he shall die. Meaning in a court, which apparently at one time was very common, what would happen is if a father did something wrong, they would kill the whole family.
Right.
Okay. Now, interesting enough, let me write. It's like it's almost getting time to the end.
Right.
Interesting enough, this is one of the few verses which appears other places in the Tanakh. Now, the Tanakh, again, as I mentioned before, you have to understand the Tanakh does not bring over, very much about how the Jewish people kept the commandments. It was very rare. So, for example, in the book of Joshua and Judges, we don't see people talking about circumcision, but invariably, when they talk about non-Jews, the name for non-Jews is very simple, Udo, which means somebody who's not circumcised, because the Jews were circumcised and everybody else was not. So when you say that the people who were not Jewish are uncircumcised, it's sort of an indication that you are circumcised, but it never talks about anybody being circumcised.
That's a good point, yeah.
There are very few circumcisions actually mentioned specifically in the Torah. Isaac's is mentioned, but not Jacob's, by the way. Moshe's son is mentioned also, his circumcision, because his wife Yocheved did it. His wife did it, not Yocheved. I forgot the name of the poem. Okay, whatever. Come back to me. Okay, but it's very rarely mentioned. It's mentioned that after the 40 years in the desert, they circumcised themselves again, because whilst they were traveling, it was very dangerous. If you circumcise and you travel afterwards, it could cause the child to die, so they weren't able to do it. There was life takes precedence. So they don't mention things very often, but this is actually mentioned in a context twice, in the second books of Kings and the second book of Chronicles. So let's look at the second book of Kings first. That's 2 Kings 14, verse 6. Now, in this particular instance, we're talking about Amaziah, whose father was killed, and he took over. Now, when he was in a certain position of power, he dealt with those people who took it over. So I'll read it from the English side of it, and I'll go back to the Hebrew to where Brown makes his point. But it happened when the kingship was firmly in his power that he struck down his servants who had assassinated the king, his father. But he did not put to death the sons of the assassins, as it is written in the book of the Torah of Moses, which Hashem had commanded. Fathers shall not be put to death because of sons, and sons shall not be put to death because of fathers. Rather, a man shall be put to death for his own sin. Now, the translation is the same in both places, obviously, but the Hebrew has slight differences. Okay, where it says Yimsi, Yimsi. In one place it says Yimis. It's leaving out a vav. A very small difference you wouldn't notice in the translation. The meaning is also the same, but it's a slight difference. The same thing occurs in the Book of Chronicles. So Dr. Brown says, well, that indicates, of course, that there's a problem with it, whatever. And basically, it could be that a variant struck into the text, and that's what stayed with us. That, it's just written incorrectly. It's no big deal. Doesn't mean anything. Or it could be that the real meaning it's just an error that was crypted into the text there, or whatever. It's nothing. Doesn't mean anything to us. But Brown thinks it's important. It's a good question to ask. It was so unimportant that I didn't even look into the text to see if anybody says anything about it. Because whatever the reasons for it there, whether it's not really a direct quote from it, it's just a paraphrase or whatever, it really wouldn't make a difference whether it's a mistake or not, because it's just historical record. That's what happened. The king did not put to death the children of the assassins of his father, because the Torah said you're not supposed to do it. Whether he quotes the verse correctly or not is totally irrelevant. It has nothing to do with it. But again, the question is a legitimate question. And again, that is what the whole point of this is that the questions are legitimate questions. And for that reason, there's nothing wrong with me asking questions about Christians. For example, just what we did tonight, pointing out the differences between the book of Mark and the book of John with regards to the resurrection, with some very serious differences there of what's going on, which are very hard to reconcile, saying, two people relating the same event. It's quite hard to say that. Two people relating the same event. So that's really the point. The point is, in fact, that these are legitimate. Now, next week, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss Dr. Brown's conclusions. We're going to read what he concludes, and I'm going to critique his conclusions. And then I'm going to give my conclusions of how we're supposed to deal with it. And also, I'm going to try and go, as long as we have time on that, to give you a little bit of what my approach is going to be in all the future lectures when we deal with issues about Christianity, when the critiques I'm going to do, what my view is going to be on these issues. And hopefully, again, if you have questions, you, of course, this will be up on YouTube. You can ask questions. It's been very, those of you who do look on YouTube, you'll probably enjoy it. There has been a very active discussion there.
Right.
A number of people are discussing there together with me. It was very respectful and very nicely done. Very nice comments and very nice questions. So you can look there. William, do you see any question jump out at you from the box there now?
Not necessarily pertaining. There's just for the record, for the people watching, if you're on chat and you want to send a message in, do like Grycycle had sent in a comment tagging Tanakh Talk. That way I can spot it very easily. He had a statement there. Says, can we dispense with Noahidism? Our people are too great for that, says Rabbi Carrier. I don't know what that means, but
I don't know who that is.
Yeah.
Maybe one time I would go into the Noahide laws. I have learned quite a bit about that. There are a number of, I think, misunderstandings about it.
Right.
And specifically because of people coming out of an organized church and coming into a knowledge of Noahide laws. It's totally different to what you've grown up in. And like anytime you enter something that's different, it's very hard to understand it. And as rabbis, most of the people involved in it, we look at things basically from, well, what are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? And we don't, you don't always get people who will, give you what's behind it. I was recently actually in Eretz Yisrael in Israel, and I had a meeting with a long discussion about the issue with Rabbi Weiner, who wrote the Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, Sheva Mitzvahs Hashem, I think it's called. It's 3 volumes set in Hebrew, and it's been translated in English. His translator was also there. His name is Michael Shulman, called The Divine Code, which a lot of no-hides are using. And we had a lot of discussions about mostly other issues besides halukha, besides law, but other issues that, whatever. So maybe sometime, if you want,
that sounds good.
But we could have a discussion about that. I know sometimes down the line, maybe I'll put something together, and if I'm a little bit lazy and I don't want to do one of this, I'll just throw that in one week just for the fun of it.
That sounds good. Well, it's been a great show. Very full. Can't wait to go back and rewatch it now so I can actually write it all down. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you all for taking part in the cordial conversations. Really appreciate that. All your feedback is much appreciated. If you'd like the show and more, please feel free to go to tanaktalk.com, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and all the other good stuff. And if you're on YouTube and you subscribe, be sure to turn on notifications. Otherwise, it's not doing any good. So you guys have a great week, and we will see you on the other side. Shalom, shalom, shavua tov. Thank you, Rabbi.
חשוב